Hello, and welcome to the Cambridge PhDcasts. Today, I'm speaking to Graham Riach, who's a PhD student in the Faculty of English here at Cambridge. And Graham is working on contemporary short fiction, post-apartheid short fiction in South Africa. So, Graham, would you like to give us a little bit of an introduction to short fiction in South Africa?
It's a long question.
Yes.
It stretches quite far back. So the first things that you see are appearing about the middle of the 1800s in little journals and stuff. And there's a kind of tradition comes out of this that would be what you might call the traditional short story. It tends to be fireside tales and things like that, usually quite oral style and kind of adventure narratives and things like that. But at a certain point, the short story becomes influenced, I suppose, by overseas developments and also by the changing conditions in South Africa. And the modern short story starts to come to the fore. It has had a couple of peaks, some around the sort of early 1900s, particularly in the 1950s, which was called the Drum Decade because of a magazine, Drum, where there were a lot of very popular authors published, like Cam Temba, Richard Reeve, Alex Ligama, people like that. They were very influenced by American culture. A lot of them have a kind of hard-boiled feel about them. And then as time goes on into the 1960s, there were also some more short stories, but poetry really came to the fore then. But then again, later in the 1970s and 80s, you had a different kind of short fiction that was very social realist. It was about the immediate conditions of what was happening in South Africa. It was extremely politically charged. It was described by one critic, Njibulu Ndebele, as the spectacular. It was the conditions that they were describing were so extreme and so polarised in some way. All that fiction could do was just reflect what was happening. It couldn't project anything further. As you get into the 1980s, though, this projection begins to happen. There's a kind of futurity starts happening in short fiction and also in the novel, where you get these apocalyptic landscapes. There's one novel in particular called Die Geliefde Land, which is The Promised Land by Karel Schoeman, which is this kind of a projection into an imagined future beyond apartheid. So the short story followed this in various ways, and the first short story that I discuss is from 1989, so actually not quite post-apartheid, just a little before, because I'm trying to show that transition. And
a time of huge change, presumably.
Absolutely,
in fiction as well as in politics. And
that's it. Yeah, that's it. I mean, there are all sorts of things going on. You know, you've got the Berlin Wall coming down. You've got these rumblings of change happening in Russia. You've got the possibility of change slowly appearing on the horizon in South Africa as well. So there's a kind of global context of change going on. And this story from 1989 reflects that sort of apocalyptic drive. And it's by a man called Ivan Vladislavich, and it concerns a large monument that's sitting on a hilltop that bears an uncanny resemblance to a real monument called the Voortrekker Monument, which is outside Pretoria. And it's a kind of band of modern-day Voortrekkers who find themselves in this post-apocalyptic landscape, and they make their way to this monument and set up their home in it. But there's one particular girl who tries to resist.
Okay, so this is 1989.
That's
and
89,
you take the story essentially from there up until the present day.
And the most recent ones I'm looking at the minute were published last year, about 7 months ago or something like that.
Right up to date. That's fantastic. So can you tell me a little bit about what it is that draws you to studying the short story as a form in this particular period?
There are a few different reasons for it. I mean, one of the most important things is that I feel it's something that people don't talk about enough. It's very understudied, and I think these short stories are excellent and deserve more attention. So
you're bringing hopefully a new readership.
That's it. I'm partly a PR campaign for the South African short story, but also I think there are tendencies within the short story towards different ways of representing experience that perhaps the novel is less inclined towards. I'm always very hesitant to set a definite cutting off point between the two. I think as the texts become shorter, they tend to exhibit particular features to greater degrees. One critic, Austin Wright, describes it as recalcitrance, the recalcitrance of the form, by which he means the difficulty to the reader that comes about through the impediments of the very shortness. So the shorter it gets, the less information you're given, the more elliptical it becomes, the more that you can't be told. So this process of resistance that the shorter text has towards you puts the reader in a position to make sense out of this. You have to look into these texts, draw out your own meanings, draw your own conclusions. And the way that he discusses it is very much on the formal level. He looks at it in the context of the story as a kind of self-enclosed unit. He thinks you get to, for example, the end of a short story is often very ambiguous. It poses more questions than it answers. And he thinks you get to this stage, and when you don't understand, you're forced to go back into the text and look back through it to come up with the possibilities that you can think of to make this story make sense. I'm trying to take this one step further with what I'm doing in these late and post-apartheid short stories, and suggesting that they don't only have a formal recalcitrance, but they also have what I'm calling a political recalcitrance.
Okay, so what would that mean?
It's split into two different parts. Firstly, they're politically recalcitrant, and it's important to mark the difference, just remembering how political writing had been in the 1970s and 80s in South Africa. It was extremely politicized.
Overtly so.
Yeah. Almost to the exclusion of everything else. These short fictions that have been appearing since apartheid are less explicitly political. And what I mean by that political recalcitrance is, firstly, the short story in its modern form, as it's appeared since the end of apartheid, has become increasingly literary. It's harder to read. It's based more on a kind of modernist aesthetic of difficulty of comprehension, subtlety of feeling. It's not political sloganeering, it's more subtle. And there's something about writing in that mode which resists any overt political commentary, I think. It's recalcitrant in that if you're in this very literary, aesthetic, lyric mode, and suddenly somebody starts talking about miners' strikes, it's unseemly, it's inappropriate.
Yeah, of course.
That's it, exactly. It's like somebody's I don't know, told a slightly off-colour joke or something, and the thing, it doesn't cohere anymore. So it's recalcitrant in that sense, but I think that this absence of talking about politics in the short story also puts a kind of ethical burden on the reader to come up with political solutions for the questions that are not being answered in these texts. So the recalcitrance works in two ways. It's resisting talking about politics, and it's at the same time forcing the reader into thinking about politics. And that's what I think the short story has been doing over the last 20 or so years.
Which is fascinating. I think it's interesting, and I know you're unwilling to draw two distinct boundaries, if that makes sense, between short fiction and longer form fiction, for example. But I mean, could I press you very slightly? Do you see short fiction as doing fundamentally different things to what we would think of as the novel in South Africa?
Okay, so there are kind of two camps in this. An essentialist camp and a relativist camp. And a lot of this criticism comes out of American short story theory. So the essentialist camp says short stories have something unique about them. They have a generic particularity that nothing else can do. And some of the people, Nadine Gordimer, a very famous South African short story writer, would probably fall largely into this camp. She says that short story writers see by the light of the flash of fireflies. It's this momentary part of experience. It can't tell you narrative. You see this flash and then it disappears. It's in and out. Someone else would be someone like Frank O'Connor, who talks about the short story. In his book, The Lonely Voice, he describes a short story as a form which can show man alone on the stage, which every man has to occupy on his own. It's not a social form. It's about an individual. It's about the people that have been left out of society. It's about the grotesques, as Sherwood Anderson called them. So this is the essentialist camp. They say the short stories are doing this thing that the novel can't do, or that the novella can't do. On the other hand, you have the relativist camp, which says that texts can partake of the short story to greater or lesser degrees. I think Mary Louise Pratt describes genres as being institutions, historical through and through. So it's almost like these forms can exhibit greater or lesser degrees of short storyness, and one aspect of that would be the recalcitrance I was talking about. I fall more into the latter camp. I don't think you can say if it has more than 12,000 words, it's not a short story anymore. There are parts of novels, and there are novels, particularly more experimental novels, that if you extracted a section from them and isolated it, you could read it as a short story. But there is something, I think, about approaching a text which is physically smaller that changes your orientation towards it. So if you pick up Ulysses, for example, 900 and whatever pages as it is, although it's sad to say, there's some part of you that thinks, I have to get through this eventually.
Yeah. If only so that your arms can have a rest.
That's it. Whereas if you're coming at a text that's shorter, I think you're more likely to pay closer attention to each aspect of it. The smaller a thing, the less information usually, or the fewer parts it has, the more attention needs to be paid to each of those individual parts. So there's that readerly orientation towards a short text, which I think is different from a longer text. Also, short stories are consumed differently often. They can be published in journals or magazines. They're often published in short story anthologies, for example, where you have a number of authors one after the other. So what you read before and what you read after is going to change the way that you read this text in the middle. You also often, a lot of the single author collections that I'm looking at are close to what have been called short story cycles or short story sequences, which is a series of stories which are interlinked to greater or lesser degrees. And the most famous example of a short story cycle is probably Dubliners by James Joyce, which focuses on individual characters, but in the process of doing so creates a portrait of a city. A lot of the authors I'm looking at do similar things. Occasionally you get characters that will reoccur across stories, sometimes playing minor roles, whereas they were previously the main character. In other collections, the connections are more subtle. It's a particular imagery, particular signs or symbols that will recur across the stories. For example, monuments, one of the things that I talk about in my first chapter. In Ivan Vladislavich's collections, Missing Persons, Propaganda by Monuments, and his most recent one, The Lost Library and Other Stories, these monuments keep popping up. So within each short story cycle, you have this world being created that operates by particular codes of signs that creates a particular feeling in that collection. And with Vladislavich, it's more interesting because they follow on from book to book. So in a sense, you have to read his whole works as a whole thing to get a sense of this, how this constellation works.
Okay. So Graham, you've mentioned Ivan Vladislavich's work, and would you like to maybe tell us a bit more about that, but also about what you're hoping to do with it and what you found in it?
Okay, so Ivan Vladislavich, his name doesn't sound very South African. I think it was his great-grandfather was Croatian, I think, and emigrated at a certain point. But Vladislavich is South African through and through. He was born in Pretoria, but is most famous for his writing about Johannesburg, which is a city he's lived in for a very long time. In the chapter where I talk about Ivan Vladislavich, my concern is one that has been very prominent in post-apartheid literature, which is about the politics of memory and memorialisation and how that happens. Who gets remembered, for what reasons? And a lot of this has come to the fore through the workings of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there's a lot about that. But the angle that I'm taking on it is the way that monuments are used in his fiction to remember things in different ways, and the way that the process of monumentalisation has changed over time. I mean, monuments are always very interesting, particularly state monuments, because they mediate the relationship between the state and the citizen. And although they seem to be about the past, they're actually as often about the present and projecting themselves into the future. They're creating a particular vision of the past that they're saying, through their grand size, takes on the characteristic of some kind of work of nature. So they say this is timeless, it's endless. And in doing so, they create an image of what the past has to be, and so guide the rails for where the future is going to go.
It's absolutely stamped from the present, physically.
That's
you
it.
can't avoid it, yeah.
But the problem is, these symbols are so powerful, they often also become rallying grounds for opposition. You only need to see this with protests that have happened in Tahrir Square or something like that. You know, these big military squares are so often used for revolutionary moments. You have the large statue of Saddam Hussein, which is very famously torn down, this endlessly repeated bit of film of the man sort of hitting Saddam Hussein with his shoe on the top of the head. So I'm very interested in the way that these monuments are used, and there's something that come up a lot in Vladislavich's fiction.
And you've said that they recur constantly throughout his various collections.
They do recur, but they change. This is what is the most interesting thing for me, and it's why I'm starting with him at the end of the apartheid period. And as I described, there's this large Voortrekker monument, and the modern day Voortrekkers come to live in it. This is a monument of what I like to think of as the kind of old style. It's massive. It's unavoidably present. It's actually an extremely ugly building. It's very square. It looks like a big block that's just been dumped on this hill outside Pretoria. It has an enormous marble frieze on the inside of it that narrates the history of the Afrikaner people, their signing of the land treaty, in inverted commas, with Dingane and things like that, which was basically a document that stole the land from part of the indigenous population and is now, I believe, buried under the lodestone of this Voortrekker monument, or at least I think that's how the story goes.
It's obviously a massively uneasy and controversial kind of monument.
Yeah. But then in his next collection, Propaganda by Monuments and Other Stories is the name of it, it changes a bit. So there was a bit of a discovery with this story, actually. So it was published in a collection in 1996, which is after the transition period, which went from 1990 to 94, which is when the apartheid regime was being dismantled and talks were going on to see how the power would be handed over. I found an earlier version of this story that was published in 1992 in a magazine called Staff Rider, which was a kind of slightly samizdat underground magazine during the 1970s, 80s and early 90s, where you would get a lot of black authors being published who were denied the possibility of publication because of the government control over publishing houses and the government censorship. But in here you would get an amazing mixture of journalism and photojournalism, a lot of poetry, short stories, all just kind of piled together in a collage on the page. Often individual authors' names weren't cited, it was the writers' group that they belonged to. So anyway, I found this earlier printing in 1992, and often when people talk about this story, they talk about it as a kind of seminal post-apartheid text. And I'm trying to say, actually, it's a little bit more slippery than that. It's not a post-apartheid text. It's written during what was still an extremely unstable period in the early 1990s. And in this story, you have it's split into 5 parts, and it consists of taxi driver in Pretoria, also called Boniface Khumalo, who sends a letter to the Russian government because he's heard that they're getting rid of an enormous stone head of Lenin. And he is rebranding his shebeen, which is a kind of bar. It used to be called, I think, the Boniface Tavern or something like that, and he's going to call it the V.I. Lenin Bar and Grill. So he tries to get this enormous stone head of Lenin sent from Moscow over to Pretoria. So he sends a letter to the Russian government, and en route to the person it's meant to get to, Pavel Grekov, a translator in the Department of Everyday Affairs, which is this fantastic name, gets hold of this and becomes obsessed with this letter, and he kind of annotates it and writes it up. So the first part of the story is Grekov just after he's received the letter, and Grekov makes his way to this unnamed square in Moscow, where he watches a head of Lenin being taken down. By this stage, quite a few of these heads have been taken down, and there aren't that many people there to watch it anymore. I can read you the bit if you want.
Yeah, that'd be great,
I marked out the place.
This would be fantastic.
So I can let you hear. So this is Grekov has made his way to this square, and he's looking at the workers taking this apart. So he says, "The eyes in the head of Lenin looked straight at Grekov. On this particular afternoon, as expected, 2 workers in overalls were standing on Lenin's bald pate, one wielding a noisy pneumatic drill and the other a gigantic iron clamp. A ladder rested against the cliff of a cheek, and at its foot a third worker was lounging against the pedestal. A lorry surmounted by a crane and braced at each corner by a huge hydraulic leg with an orthopaedic boot on the end of it stood to one side. Grekov judged that he was in good time, and so he crossed to the opposite pavement, which had been shovelled more recently, slowed his steps and strolled on at a leisurely pace, his usual one, enjoying the progressive revelation of detail. Naturally, the stone head loomed larger the closer he got. The features, at first indistinct, now clarified themselves. The eyes were still looking straight at him, even though he had changed pavements. On a smaller scale, this phenomenon might have qualified as a miracle. On this scale, it was undoubtedly a question of perspective. They were kindly eyes, if not quite grandfatherly, then more than avuncular. But as the mouth came into focus, beneath the sculpted wings of the moustache, the whole face changed. It became severe and irritable. It took on the cross expression of a bachelor uncle who didn't like children. And then, quite unaccountably, as he came closer still, the face foreshortened into friendliness again. It's wonderful. So he's approaching this enormous statue. The eyes are following him, looking straight at him. You have this idea of a face-to-face encounter with history. And as the physical distance between him and this monument changes, the way that he perceives this figure differs. It's almost as if the physical distance between him and the monument is mirroring the temporal distance between these events happening. So you get this first very warm perception of Lenin as this grandfatherly figure. Then suddenly the horrors of what he did come out. But then you have this nostalgia, or ostalgia as they called it, nostalgia for the old East starts to happen, and he starts to take on this friendly expression again. Of course, minutes later it gets torn from its plinth and put on the back of a truck and carried off to a dumping ground. But
there's kind of amazing comedy to it, as well as I think a very serious historical point at its core.
I should point out that Ivan Vladislavich is hilarious. And his stories are very, very funny. So this all happens, and there's then an exchange of letters, and you see the kind of annotated, translated letters. Then there's a very strange offcut in the middle, which looks like it's been cut out of a kind of Soviet magazine and just pasted in the middle. But anyway, the story ends up with Khumalo back in Pretoria receiving the letter back from the Russian government to say that he is probably going to get his head of Lenin. It's not quite fixed yet, but he's going to get it. And he's sitting in Stridham Square in the middle of Pretoria. Stridham was an apartheid-era leader who was instrumental in the setting up of apartheid. And he looks at this large head. It's a large bronze head of Stridham in the middle of Stridham Square. And you have this large sculpture that goes over the top like this, and a fountain with these horses coming out of it, which was the old freedom symbol. Now, the freedom symbol has now gone out of use, and there's fetid water sitting at the bottom of it. There's this stink coming off the apartheid era freedom symbol, and this head sitting looking out at him. And the story ends with Khumalo seeing how, but not necessarily why, the impossible came to pass. This is the last line of the story. And then this is it finished, and that, like I say, the burden of the reader is then to say, well, hold on a minute, we're at a crossroads here. What direction are they going to take? There's this idea of international trade opening up, but there's still this idea of a kind of Marxist history, which was the history of the ANC, the party that took power in 1994, that's still rumbling away in the background. If you read the story from 1996, you see what route was taken. They chose an increasingly neoliberal economic policy. I mean, it wasn't quite as bad as it was going to get by that stage, but you see which way they went. And this is why it's so important to read the story from 1992, because at that point, you're standing in the middle of the crossroads. Are they going to take a socialist alternative, or are they going to take a neoliberal alternative?
So the ambiguity that you've spoken about as being in the short story's form is also kind of, that's reflecting the ambiguity in the politics of the time as well.
That's it.
Kind of, everything's at a crossroads, everything's up for debate, up for grabs.
Absolutely, and there's a great story actually, just completely by chance, this same head in the same square, some years later, after apartheid had ended, it's a real place, it's a real head, there was construction going on for a luxury car park, I think it was, underneath Stridham Square, so there was all sorts of kind of pneumatic drills and things being used. And on the day that would have been Republic Day under the old apartheid regime, this celebration of all the good that apartheid has done, these vibrations caused a crack. The head fell, split in two and smashed. There's a great photograph of the whole square as a kind of sinkhole with this head sitting in the middle of it. And you think, well, yeah, the monuments deal with themselves sometimes, but obviously the implications of a new luxury car park knocking down this head of an apartheid-era leader carries with it a bit of a dark undertone as well.
Of course.
Who's benefiting from this? Is it the imposition of a new regime of disparity that's replacing one that's previously operated on racial grounds but is now operating along economic ones?
So that's a fascinating introduction to Ivan Vladislavich's work and into monuments in history. I suppose, what are some of the other themes that your research is addressing? Maybe some other authors as well.
Well, the way that they fit together, I mean, chapter by chapter, I do address separate authors, and they're also largely thematically based as well. But although the authors are kept separate, the themes are a little bit more like a kind of Venn diagram that intersect in various places with a short story at the middle. And I was talking about memory here. My next chapter on Zoe Wickham, I talk about class and coloured identity. The next chapter I talk about land and landscape in South Africa. These are three issues which I think have been very important in the post-apartheid period: memory, class, landscape. How can you talk about monuments without thinking about landscape and place? How can you think about memory without thinking about class? How can you talk about land and land ownership without thinking about class? So the three of them intersect in different ways, but the chapters are author by author. And after the Władysławicz chapter, I start talking about a collection by an author called Zoe Wickham, whose most recent collection is called The One That Got Away, which is even closer to what you would call a short story cycle or a short story sequence. It has a few names than Władysławicz's one is. In this one you have some recurring characters that pop up and again. It's interesting in that it's split across two countries, South Africa and Scotland. I have a bit of a hand in that because Zoe, I mean, just a little bit of her biography. I mean, she was born in 1948, which is, as I'm sure you know, the year that the National Party came to power in South Africa and began to really put the policies that would later become apartheid into practice. She was born in a small town called Beeswater. She attended the University of the Western Cape, which was the coloured university at that point. Now, it's maybe interesting to pause for a second there and talk about the madness that was the apartheid racial classificatory system. So it was split broadly into white, coloured and African, or Bantu they were sometimes called. These different sections of society were accorded different privileges. The white population had the most. The coloured population, which was often the product of intermarriage, often between the earlier Dutch settlers and the local Khoisan population, who were the indigenous people who lived at the Cape when the Dutch arrived. But it became a bit of a catch-all category. I'll come back to that, but just for a second, and the other people were black, who were the other indigenous Africans. And part of it was to do with the colour of your skin. The darker you were, the more likely you were to be put in a category. But the coloured category is particularly interesting because it shows how arbitrary the distinctions were. It became a category where you would have people of mixed race, you would have Khoisan people, you would have some black people who had lighter skin, and the madness of it was shown because year by year people would change category. You would be coloured one year and you would hand in your application form and you would be reclassified as white. Some coloured people put in an application for political purposes to be reclassified as black in a kind of an act of solidarity of one kind or another. But the coloured population has always occupied a kind of in-between position in South African society, which was, of course, brought with it some material benefits. There was more money put into coloured education than there was into black education. There were more facilities accorded to the coloured population, to the black population. But this also leaves you in a very compromised position. You have a foot in each camp. You're not accepted into the more conservative white society. You're also slightly envied and perhaps pushed away by some members of the black community as well. So they were left in a very unstable position. And towards the end of apartheid, I mean, it began in the 1970s, but it intensified as the 1980s went on. The apartheid government, I think, became more aware that this couldn't continue in the way it did. They realised that if they wanted to continue to hold power after according the vote to a larger percentage of the population, they would need the support of coloured voters. So in order to do this, they started to give more and more money towards improving the conditions for the coloured population. More money was put into education, more money was put into job creation. Different posts which were previously barred to coloured people opened up. So what happened in effect was what had previously been a strict, legally enforced, racially classified system became a class system during the last 20 years of apartheid. It's important here to remember that these two things, you can't say race is over here, class is over here. These two things, they work through one another. Stuart Hall says race is the modality through which class is lived, and this is very true. You can't pull them apart. But at the same time, the conditions that were in place during the last decades of apartheid, the apartheid government in some sense was, they pulled a bit of a fast one, if you like. When apartheid finished officially, the class striation that had been created by this economic policy meant that the living conditions were perpetuated past the end of apartheid. Even now you can see quite clear striation between what would have been the white, coloured and black populations in terms of income, in terms of access to education, in terms of unemployment, in terms of job, access to healthcare, whatever measure you want to take it by, it still pretty much holds. There's been a small percentage of the black population and the coloured population that has become exceptionally rich. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world according to its Gini coefficient, and this has not become smaller since the end of apartheid. It's become wider. You might think that's surprising, but the reasons for it are no longer interracial differences, they're intra-racial differences. You have a very small percentage of the black population that has become exceptionally rich, leaving the majority behind. The same with some aspects, some parts of the coloured population. This has happened also.
So tell us a little bit about how the short fiction of Zoe Wickham then addresses these issues and this kind of poisoned legacy.
So Zoe Wickham, as I said, was classified as coloured under the apartheid system. She left South Africa in 1970 to come and live in Britain. Her fiction deals with a lot of the anxieties that coloured people faced in terms of occupying this unstable, somebody called it a midfield position. You're sort of neither one nor the other. And the way that race and class are entangled is very present in Zoe Wickham's writing. And it's also kind of amplified or refracted through this international aspect of her being a relatively well-off coloured South African living in Britain, but returning to South Africa at various times, and the way this growing internationalisation, particularly since the end of apartheid, can be both a blessing and a curse. And there's a bit in one of her short stories where you see, I'll read that one out for you as well if you like, where you have, so the story is about, it's called, there's the bird that never flew, which is part of the motto of Glasgow. The story is about Jane, the young coloured protagonist who goes on a honeymoon trip with her artist husband, Drew. It's a very funny name for an artist. One of her aunties says, Drew, what kind of a name is that? All finished and clar, as if his career's in the past already. She arrives in Scotland and is the object of various kind of awkward racial taunts. She feels alienated through looking different. People talk to her slowly, point at her in the street and things like that. But even back at home, there's a very difficult positioning, and I'll read out the section. So Jane has just met Margaret, the cleaning woman in the hotel that she's staying in Scotland. So there's a kind of class thing going on there. This is a South African tourist who can afford to fly to Scotland, meeting up with a member of what is probably the working class. So I can't do all the accents. I'll do the Glasgow one, but not the others. Och, the woman cleaning the hotel lobby said in response to Jane's exaggerated shiver, "It's a grand day, hen." She stopped, leaning on her mop. "Yous don't want it too hot for doing the tourist things." In Glasgow, the familiar yous was comforting. Just like Drew's Cape Town relatives, the aunties who had to be visited before the couple went on their overseas honeymoon. They sipped tea from cups that were introduced as if they were posh cousins with double-barrelled names. "Royal Doulton Bone China," they were announced. And all the while the aunties offered advice. "Yous must take your coats even if it's summer over there. They say you must watch out for cockneys, first-class skelms. Those people must stand your ground with the camera. Those people sommer shove you out the way with their camcorders. The aunties would want to see it all. They would throw a homecoming party for the photographs. The new family-in-law certainly wanted to see everything. Aunt Trudy instructed Jane to kneel by her chair and then unashamedly set about checking the hair in the nape of her neck for frizz. Always a giveaway, the old hag said. Drew laughed uproariously. Yes, she was absolutely right. It gave away everything about the one who investigates. So this is great. So you see, this politics of hair was one of the ways that your racial identity was tested under apartheid. There was a thing called the pencil test. So you put a pencil in your hair, and if your hair could hold the pencil, you were considered to be non-white. So this checking the nape of the neck for frizz, the coloured population would often use hair straightening products to appear more white. And you can see in this with buying the Royal Doulton china, there's a kind of aspirational class politics going on there. It's this
admixture of class and of race concerns. It's one, and all part of this kind of nightmarish bureaucratic situation that people find themselves in.
And the way that this is in the post-apartheid period, but the people who lived under apartheid are still upholding these small differences, these petty distinctions on which the apartheid system operated. This auntie is still checking the nape of her neck and still serving her tea in her little teacups.
So a real sense that, as you said, things haven't ended, that there's as much continuity as there is change, really.
Yes, I mean, don't underestimate just how much that things have changed. I mean, there has been greatly increased provision of education. There have been steps made to improve housing, supply of electricity. I mean, over and above that, people are free to move where they want. They don't have to carry their passes anymore. So there have been extraordinary changes made, but at the same time, like you say, you can't ignore the extent to which this legacy continues and impedes people from moving on from a darker past.
So, Graham, what comes next in this research? You mentioned some work on landscape. What are you hoping to do in the rest of the time that's still to come?
Okay, well, there are a few things to do in the time that's still to come, but the next thing that I'm going to do is to write about an author called Henrietta Rose Ennis, who's one of my favourite authors in South Africa. I mean, I couldn't recommend her highly enough. What I find very interesting in her work is the way that she uses space and landscape in her stories. Now, just to give you a bit of context as to why that's so important in South Africa, the way that landscape has been depicted, both in painting and in literature, in South Africa, but in colonial contexts more broadly, is always politically motivated. It's very common to see landscape paintings painted with no people in them. You have novels about farms where the black labour that works on them is occluded. The reason for this is it's something that can't be spoken. It's this hidden, dark, gothic, doubled underside, this kind of unhomely feeling of these uninhabited landscapes. It's something that J.M. Coetzee in his book White Writing pinpointed and nailed down and really gave a great critique of why that was so problematic. And he talks about the Plaasroman, which is the farm novel in Afrikaans, and the way that to satisfy the critics of rural retreat, they had to show labour happening. But to satisfy the critics of colonialism, it couldn't be black labour doing it. So what ends up is you see white people working on the farm, and the black presence is just absent. Yes, it's cast into shadow by the eye of the author. If you see the eye as an I, me, which Virginia Woolf described as casting a shadow onto the rest of the text. This kind of a patriarchal eye. So, but anyway, in Rose Ennis, I think that she's picking this up for the post-apartheid period and writing about landscape in a way that's very different. She's taking landscapes and specifically packing them with life and packing them with living things. And quite often the way that these living things are encountered is through finding traces of them. She's very interested in archaeology, and people keep finding remains, ruins, these dilapidated houses in the countryside that bear traces of previous civilizations and previous people that have lived there. She does this, I think, because to show the people actually being there, would perhaps be misrepresentative of the experience of a lot of white South Africans. And when I was over there earlier this year for 2 months, and I was really struck by how limited the contact was between the white people I met there and the black people around them. They often have them working in their houses, they might have them as drivers or in various other contexts, but usually the encounter happens through more oblique angles, if you see what I mean. And Rose Ennis, I think, has definitely very much put her finger on this. I mean, there's a great story of hers called Falling, which is about a young, I mean, it starts very much in the thick of the action with a man spread-eagled on the glass-domed roof of a shopping centre, looking down into it. And he has this memory of when he was younger, going with his father, who I think was an architect, and accidentally knocking a brick with his foot down over the side of the construction works, looking down, seeing a worker looking up with the brick coming towards him, and then at the last second he turns away, he can't look at it anymore, and he's haunted by this image. So he then goes back as an adult to this place and spread eagles himself and looks down at the shopping centre below and tries to process this. And at one point a black security guard comes and helps him down off the roof, and he has this moment of kind of partial epiphany as he I think it says something like he felt that what was previously stable had come loose or come out of joint. But yeah, I can let you hear a bit of it if you want, if we have time. And the start of it's great. She's such a wonderful writer. Okay, so Victor selects a square of glass and touches it with his palms. He's very high up. From where he stands, he can see the whole long flank of the mountain and, on the other side, the Cape Town suburbs fanning out into the sea. At his feet is a stained concrete surface, never meant to be seen, and before him rises a shining dome 3 times his height. It reflects the soft pink sunrise and his own lean figure. His face is severe, deeply lined for a man still in his 30s and determined. Only Victor himself can see something daunted in his eyes. He blinks it away and shifts to the side, so that he's looking instead at one of the rising steel beams. The beams support the dome, converging like the ribs of an umbrella. From street level, they seem as delicate as lines of latitude and longitude on a model globe, but up close, each is as broad as a big man's hand. The glass they support is thick and greenish, a cloudy mirror. Where it's bolted into grooves in the beams, there's a gap between glass and steel, wide enough to admit fingers. Victor finds the grooves, grips and leans back so that the weight hangs from his shoulders and braces his feet against the glass. Up he goes now, climbing the curve, hand over hand. Near the top, where the gradient eases out to almost horizontal, he picks a pane and lays himself flat, belly and chest against the glass. Below, the mall is waking, busying. At 9 a.m, the interior lights snap on, muted through the tinted pane, and then the glass becomes porous, revealing its depths. Here, now, this is the place. So you see what's going on there. It's this incredible lyric register describing this vista out over Cape Town, but at the same time you have this man in a psychologically disturbed position lying over this kind of cathedral to capitalism, the shopping centre. So suddenly, and as the story goes on, you find the labour that's gone into the building of this consumerist paradise, and always in the backdrop you have this countryside surrounding Cape Town. So she's taking that pastoral mode, and instead of dodging the question of how the pastoral is being maintained, she makes it explicit, and she shows from this brick landing on the man's head the violence that contains.
But then also bringing these kind of figures who would have been previously lost or previously erased in some way back into view.
That's it, absolutely. And I mean, this is what a lot of post-apartheid writing has been about. It's about voices that weren't to be heard before being heard. I mean, in Władysławicz that I spoke about earlier, in his most recent collection, The Lost Library, I said that monuments changed over the arc of his 3 stories. The first one, you had this huge monument. The second, you have this head of Lenin, but suddenly it's mobile. It shifts, and it shifts meanings. It goes from being what it was in Russia to being a kind of trinket to put in front of a bar. In the most recent collection, these presences have turned into absences. The kind of monuments he starts to describe aren't about being there, they're about not being there. There's one that he describes in Berlin by Micha Ullmann called Bibliothek, Library. This is a small glass panel on the ground, and you look inside it, and what you see inside are empty shelves. It's completely white. You see empty bookshelves, and you look in. You might think, what does this mean? You find out that it's on the site where the Nazi book burnings took place. These missing books are the books and the stories and the lives that couldn't be expressed or that have been hidden. And you think that, okay, he's talking about Germany, but he's not just talking about Germany. He's talking about the voices that weren't heard under apartheid. He's talking about the voices that still aren't being heard in South Africa right now. And I think it's exactly because of the short stories aesthetic of absence, this recalcitrance I talked about earlier, this political recalcitrance, that makes you say, you take these absences and you do something with them. You find out solutions, you try to make what was fragmented cohere.
I think it's a fascinating subject, and to come back to Władysławicz, I think just highlights again what a rich and exciting field this is. And I hope you'll have convinced some of our viewers and listeners to go and search out some South African short fiction of their own as well.
Of course, I mean, I'm sure none of these authors need my help. They're all good enough on their own. Well, but if anyone's not heard of them, please do go out there and read them.
Hopefully we'll see an uptick in it as well. I'll certainly be chasing them up myself. Listen, thank you so much, Graham.
Thank you, John.
It's been a real pleasure to speak to you.
Okay, you too.
Thanks for listening to this Cambridge PhDcast, presented by me, John Gallagher, and produced by Richard Blakemore and Ruth Rushworth, and produced in association with CRASSH. If you'd like to hear more from us or for our fantastic collection of PhDcasters, please visit the CRASSH website at crash, that's with 2 S's, .cam.ac.uk. Thank you for listening.